Please pray with me. Gracious God, may the meditations of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be a pleasing offering to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Thinking about these biblical texts, I remembered one of those life-changing events. I was in seminary in California, and I had flown to Japan to visit a good friend. We had a great time over there, but now it was time to come back to the States. Now, I made the mistake of watching the movie Final Destination the night before, which was not a good choice. And those of you who don't know what the movie Final Destination involves, it involves a plane crash, okay? Not a good option when you're flying out the next day. We took off from the Kansai airport near Osaka, but our plane experienced terrible turbulence. At one point, the plane dropped quickly, and it felt like it was quite a distance that it had dropped. My stomach went up like I was on a roller coaster, and folks were screaming. I really thought this was the end. I prayed through the 23rd Psalm and the Lord's Prayer a few times. I really thought that I was going to die. But as suddenly as it started, it stopped, and the pilot apologized profusely. Needless to say, I get a lot more nervous when I fly. Even though that happened more than 20 years ago, it has left a mark on me. Our first reading comes to us from the book of Job. This is from God's first speech to Job. You may recall that Job, up to this point, has experienced incredible suffering. All of his children have died. He lost all of his wealth. And now he is afflicted by a terrible disease that has covered him with painful boils from head to toe. And to cap things off, he's had to endure lectures from his so-called friends who have been criticizing him for some secret sin that he must have committed. Because after all, why would God have made these things happen to him unless he was being punished for some secret sin? So he's got it from all directions. The main question that Job explores is, why do the righteous suffer? And after a long silence, God finally speaks in this passage, but God never tells Job why this has happened to him. Instead, God turns the tables around and asks questions of Job. But these are questions that Job can't answer. They do, however, speak of God's great power and the splendor of God's creation. But unfortunately for us, the book of Job doesn't give an easy answer to the question of why the righteous suffer. And that is a challenge when you read the book of Job. It's tempting when we read this particular passage to think that God is basically just throwing his power back into Job's face and saying, don't complain, little worm, I'm God, you can't. But most scholars don't think that's a very good way to understand the book of Job. Rather, they believe that God is actually trying to help Job understand how important humanity is and how humanity's job is to live in the world as God lives in the world, experiencing both good and bad, suffering and good things. But our second reading, we continue through 2 Corinthians. Here Paul is talking about God's saving works. God, through Jesus Christ, has brought reconciliation to the world. The scholar Carl Holloway finds three particular points in this text. The first one is God's saving work encompasses us. The second is that God is the chief actor in the work of Jesus Christ. And the third is that the work of ministry itself is initiated and accomplished by God. It's not about us, it's about God. And of course, Paul also likes to highlight many of the struggles he himself has endured. And you may have caught it at the end. There's that little I don't know what you call it, kind of a little barb there at the end when he says, our heart is wide open to you. There is no restriction in our affection, but only in yours. In return, I speak as to children. Open wide your hearts also. Just a little thing there, a little nudge. Kind of reminds me of when I was coming home from college and my grandmother asked me if I broke my fingers. And I said, why would you ask me that, Grandma? And she's like, because you haven't called me on the phone. I was like, oh, okay. Now our gospel reading is from Mark. And it contains that familiar challenge, which is on the one hand the great power that is demonstrated over and over again that Jesus has, and at the same time, the inability of the disciples to understand. You know, as we read the Gospels, I don't know about you, but I kind of found myself just kind of hitting myself on the forehead and thinking, oh my gosh, seriously? They don't get it yet? But the subtext of this story is the ancient view that the natural world was the dwelling place of spirits, and that spirits connected with the sea were hostile to God. Jesus here is exorcising a storm-causing demon, evidenced by the use of the word rebuke, which is normally used when driving out demons. Since Jesus is in the middle of the sea, and one of the things you might notice about the Gospels is that the sea is kind of a dividing line between the Jewish world and the Gentile world. But since this is in the middle of the water, these are Jesus' words to the disciples and by extension to us. So when we hear those words from Jesus, what do they say to us? There are two accusations in this text. The first one is, "Teacher, don't you care that we are perishing?" And the second one from Jesus is, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" After Jesus stills the storm, the disciples are even more frightened than they were before. Who is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? The writer of Mark knows the answer, and so do we, the audience, even if the disciples don't know. Job's actions and the disciples' actions are perfectly understandable. It is normal to demand an answer from God when you are going through suffering. And it is normal to be scared to death when you think you're going to die. We shouldn't be so hard on these biblical characters. At the same time, notice that God didn't just wave a magic wand and put everything right. Although Job did recover from his illness, he did regain great wealth, and he had more children, the losses from before do not get erased. He still grieves the loss of his older children. And likewise, the disciples might have been rescued from the storm, but that didn't stop them from going through the suffering that they would later endure as Jesus' disciples. The truth is that as followers of Jesus Christ, we aren't guaranteed freedom from danger or freedom from suffering. Living in this world is not risk-free. God doesn't place over us an invisible bubble that protects us from harm. Rather, God promises to remain with us always. We are going to have times where, like the disciples, we will cry out to God, "Don't you care that we are drowning?" We'll be scared. will be sure that death is near. And sometimes it will be, but other times it won't be. But either way, God will be with us. And that is a challenge, because I think some of us, and I find myself falling into this trap from time to time as well, actually more often than I care to admit, where I've kind of adopted this sort of belief that, God, if I just do the right things, you'll make sure nothing bad ever happens to me. And I think a lot of us kind of have made that deal with God, so to speak. But then when those inevitably bad things do happen, then we're mad at God. We're like, God, you broke your deal. You were supposed to protect me. I did all these good things for you, and you didn't keep me safe. And we often fall into that trap. But of course, that isn't the way the world works. And we don't really know why. It's frustrating, believe me. I mean, sometimes I catch myself thinking, God, how could you let that happen? For heaven's sakes, I became a pastor for you. Come on, doesn't that earn me some points? It turns out it doesn't. But we fall into that trap sometimes nonetheless. All of us do. But the important thing to remember is that God is with us no matter what we go through. Sometimes we will suffer. Sometimes bad things will happen to us. But God will always be there beside us. So let's try not to be so hard on the disciples. Having been on an airplane thinking I was going to die, I'm a little bit more sympathetic. Of course, I made the mistake of telling my father, the former pilot, and he's like, oh, Chris, you don't have to worry about that sort of stuff. Downdrafts disperse long before you hit the ground. Thanks, Dad. Thanks. I wonder if he would necessarily be thinking about that if he were in that situation, but yeah. And I'm just teasing you, Dad, just teasing you. Actually, I realize when I say these things, the people do watch my sermons, and I didn't mean any harm. I still love you, okay? But it's easy to get upset when bad things happen to us. It's easy to get scared. But God has promised to be with us always. And that is something we can always count